neon lights from the bar flickered overhead, casting a soft golden hue across the dimly lit room. My drink, barely touched, rested in front of me, the glass rimmed with the condensation of an evening I had no intention of turning into something more. But as I sat there, staring into the amber liquid, my mind wandered back to something I'd heard in passing, something I couldn't shake: the black man's reputation in bed. I had heard the stories. Women whispered it, laughed about it, boasted about it even. Some said it was a myth, others swore it was truth. But the curiosity had been building for months, no years, and tonight I was feeling bold. My husband David and I had drifted apart. The fire that once burned between us had long since been extinguished, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly desired. Our intimacy was functional, a mere routine we'd fallen into, neither of us making the effort to spark something more. I needed to feel wanted again. Needed to know what it was like to be alive in that way. To feel my body wake up to a touch that wasn't just expected but thrilling. I glanced up, meeting the gaze of a man across the room, tall, muscular, confident, and with an intensity in his eyes that made my breath hitch. His dark skin contrasted beautifully with the white shirt he wore, which seemed to hug his chest in all the right places. He didn't smile at me, not yet. But there was something about the way he looked at me, something that told me he knew exactly what I was thinking. It was as if the universe had aligned for this moment. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was wrong. But I couldn't resist. The sexual tension between us was immediate, palpable. I felt my body stir, my heart race. My mind tried to argue, but my body was already betraying me. He made his way over to me, the sound of his footsteps drowning out everything else in the bar. I sat frozen, unsure of what to say or do, but feeling something in me deep down whispering that this was exactly what I needed. He sat down across from me with a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't ask if the seat was taken, he didn't need to. His presence commanded the space. His voice was smooth, deep, and full of confidence. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. I swallowed, the words barely coming out as I nodded. "Of course. I couldn't help but notice you sitting here alone," he continued, his eyes not leaving mine. "And I've been hearing some interesting things about you." The way he said it, his voice almost a whisper now, made me shiver. "What have you heard?" He leaned in just enough so that his breath brushed against my ear. "That you're curious." I wanted to say something clever to play it cool. But I couldn't. Instead, I found myself asking the only thing that had been on my mind for weeks. "Is it true?" I barely recognized my own voice as I spoke. "Is it true what they say about black men?" His smile was knowing. "What do they say?" I knew then that I wasn't just playing with fire. I was about to set it ablaze. Before I could answer, he took the drink from my hand and set it down on the table. His fingers grazed my wrist, sending an electric shock up my arm. The touch was simple, almost innocent, but it ignited something in me that had been dormant for far too long. "I think you already know," he said softly. "And if you're curious enough to ask, maybe we can find out together." My heart skipped a beat. The air between us was thick with desire, and I had no idea where this was going, but a part of me was already consumed by the idea of it. There was no turning back now. I wanted to ask him more, wanted to delve deeper into this temptation, but just as I opened my mouth, I felt the need to pause. "Wait," my mind screamed. "What about David?" The guilt hit me in waves, but it was fleeting. For the first time in ages, I felt powerful. Desirable. The passion I had been starving for was now right in front of me, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. Before I could think better of it, I leaned in. "How about we find out?" I said, my voice trembling with anticipation. He smiled again, a slow, wicked grin that told me everything I needed to know. "That's what I like to hear. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. I've got so much more to share, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let me take you back to the beginning, where it all started. When curiosity first took hold and I made the decision that would change everything. It didn't take long for us to set up our first meeting outside the bar. We texted for days, the conversations a mix of flirtation, teasing, and raw anticipation. I was living for every message, every hint of what was to come. The thought of it consumed me. There was no denying it anymore. I wanted him. The man I had only known for a few short days, yet already, I felt an intense pull toward him that I hadn't felt in years. I pulled up to his apartment building just after sunset, my palms sweating and heart pounding. I couldn't believe I was about to do this. But as I stepped out of my car and walked toward the entrance, all my doubt vanished. The only thing on my mind now was the fire I felt burning inside me. He was waiting for me, leaning casually against the doorframe, looking every bit as gorgeous as he had that first night. His smile was slow and confident, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. "Welcome," he said simply, his deep voice sending a shiver down my spine. He stepped aside to let me in, and the moment I entered the apartment, I could feel the tension between us building again. I could almost taste it. He didn't waste any time. The moment the door closed behind us, his hands were on me, pulling me closer, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both desperate and urgent. The kiss was nothing like anything I'd experienced before. It was fierce, raw, and the hunger I felt mirrored his. There was no need for words, just the heat of our bodies colliding, the urgency of our desires. Before I knew it, he had me on the couch, my clothes falling away piece by piece. I felt alive, free, like I was shedding the layers of my old, dull life. He was everything David was not. Assertive, confident, completely in control. And it thrilled me. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips as he looked down at me. I nodded, my body already reacting to him in ways I never thought possible. "I'm sure." Reminder to like and share. I know you're enjoying this story. Don't forget to like and share, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I've got more coming up, and trust me, it gets even more intense. Stay tuned as the affair deepens. As I lay back on his couch, the cool leather against my bare skin, I couldn't help but notice how different this was from any experience I'd had with David. There was a level of urgency, of need, in his touch that had been missing for far too long in my life. And it wasn't just physical, it was deeper, more intense. His hands weren't just exploring my body. They were demanding, taking ownership of me in a way that made my heart race. I couldn't remember the last time I felt wanted like this. He kissed me again, harder this time, his lips rough and assertive. His breath was warm against my neck, and I could feel his body pressing against mine, almost possessive. There was no hesitating now. I wanted this, I needed this. Every inch of my body was screaming for it. "You're perfect," he murmured against my skin as his lips trailed down to my collarbone. "You've got no idea how much I've wanted this." His hands moved lower, tracing the curves of my body with a firm touch that sent waves of heat flooding through me. I moaned softly, unable to control the sensations pulsing through me. This wasn't just sex. It was an awakening, a rawness I hadn't realized I craved until this moment. His lips found mine again, and as our tongues met, I could feel the heat rising between us. I was lost in the sensation of him. His taste, the weight of his hands on me, the way his body seemed to demand more, always more. He knew exactly what he was doing. I was no longer in control. Before I knew it, I found myself lying beneath him, his body covering mine as he moved between my legs. There was no hesitation now, only the sweet, undeniable pull of passion. He didn't ask if I was ready, he didn't need to. I was already lost in the moment, already craving what he had to offer. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice rough and deep. I could feel his hardness against me, and I nodded, my fingers gripping his shoulders, my body responding to his touch. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips as I felt him enter me, slowly, deliberately. It was unlike anything I'd experienced. He was bigger, deeper, more intense. My whole body seemed to come alive with each movement, each thrust that sent shockwaves through my core. I gasped, my hands clutching at the back of his neck, pulling him closer as if I could melt into him. The pleasure was overwhelming, all-consuming. I could feel every inch of him, and it felt like I was being torn apart and put back together again in the most incredible way. I couldn't think about anything else but the sensations he was creating within me. He didn't hold back. He was relentless, pushing me to places I hadn't known existed. His body moved against mine with such intensity, such force, that I was afraid I might break under the weight of it all. But I didn't want to stop. Every inch of me was alive, every nerve on fire. His rhythm was steady and sure, pushing me closer and closer to the edge. I could feel my body tightening, the pressure building until I was on the verge of losing myself completely. And then it hit. The orgasm was like a wave crashing over me, sending me spiraling into a sea of pleasure that I had never known before. I cried out, my body shuddering beneath him as I clung to him for dear life. His name fell from my lips, but it wasn't a name I should have been calling. It was him, this stranger who had ignited something inside me that I didn't know I was capable of feeling. As I came down from the high, I could hear his breath heavy, his own release coming as he thrust deeper into me. The sound of our bodies moving together was all I could focus on now, the world around us fading away as we shared that moment of raw, unfiltered pleasure. When it was over, I lay there, gasping for air, my body still trembling. He stayed close, his hands gently tracing patterns on my skin, as though we had just shared something more than just sex. It felt intimate in a way I hadn't expected. He smiled at me, his dark eyes filled with something that looked like satisfaction, and maybe even possessiveness. "You're incredible," he said, his voice low and thick with desire. "You were worth every second." I couldn't speak for a moment, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The guilt was there, lingering in the back of my mind, but it was quickly overshadowed by the intensity of what we had just shared. I didn't know where this was going or what it meant, but in that moment I knew one thing for sure. I was addicted. Addicted to the power he had over me, to the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. As I left his apartment that night, my body still humming with the pleasure he had given me, I felt a strange sense of detachment. The walk back to my car was almost surreal. The night air was cool against my skin, and I could still feel the warmth of his touch lingering on me. I hadn't been expecting to feel this way. Part of me had expected guilt to weigh me down, to crush me under the burden of what I'd just done. But it didn't. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of liberation. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the constraints of my marriage, free from the monotony of my life. And as I drove home that night, I knew I couldn't stop now. I had crossed a line and there was no going back. The desire was still there, pulsing under my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch enough. When I arrived home, David was already asleep, sprawled out on the bed, his snoring the only sound in the room. I could hear his steady breaths, but somehow I felt miles away from him. He was a stranger to me now, someone who had once held my heart but no longer had the ability to spark anything in me. I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him, my mind still reeling from the night. I was consumed by thoughts of him, the black man. The way he touched me. The way he made me feel. I should have felt guilty. I should have felt remorse. But I didn't. I felt alive. And I knew then that I couldn't let this be a one-time thing. The weeks that followed that first night were a blur. I couldn't seem to focus on anything other than him, the man who had unlocked a side of me I didn't know existed. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel his hands on me, his lips, his body. It was a constant, insistent presence in my life, filling the spaces where my marriage had grown hollow. I'd convinced myself it was just a fling, a one-off encounter that would satisfy the curiosity I'd harbored for years. But deep down I knew better. There was no turning back. The next few days were filled with texts, calls, and discreet meetups. I felt both a rush and a twinge of guilt, but the excitement overshadowed everything. Each meeting, each touch intensified my craving for him. The affair, once a secret indulgence, was beginning to seep into my daily life, coloring everything I did. And then came the moment that solidified everything. The second time we were together. I had been nervous, unsure of what to expect. The first time had been raw, immediate, the kind of intense connection you only read about in books. But the second time it was different. He knew me now, knew how to push me, how to make me feel things that were deeper, darker, more desperate. I had texted him that morning, teasingly asking if he wanted to pick up where we left off. His reply came within seconds, full of promise. "I've been waiting for you," it said. Same place, same time. I knew what it meant. I was going to meet him again. No hesitation, no second thoughts. And this time I wasn't just curious. I wanted him. When I walked into his apartment that afternoon, the air between us was electric. He didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at me, those dark eyes, that knowing smile. And then he moved toward me like he had all the time in the world, as if I were the only thing that mattered in that moment. "You're already here," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I've been waiting." There was no talk of small things, no pretense. We didn't need it. His hands were on me again, pulling me toward him, and I didn't stop him. Everything about him was dominant, and I loved it. It felt like he was taking control of my body, of my desires, and I didn't want to stop him. I was tired of being the one who held the reins. With him I didn't have to think. I didn't have to be in control. He kissed me deeply, passionately. His hands moved over my skin with practiced ease and I melted into him. His fingers traced the outline of my body, making every nerve in my skin come alive. But it wasn't just his touch. It was the way he made me feel, like I was the only woman in the world, the only one who mattered. With David there had always been distance, disconnection. But with him there was nothing but fire. I let him undress me slowly, savoring the moment. As I stood there before him I could feel my body reacting to him, to the way he looked at me, the way he touched me. His hands were rough, but in the best possible way, and I was quickly becoming addicted to the feeling of him. "You're mine," he said, his voice husky with desire. "I can make you forget about everything." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. And when he pushed me back onto the bed, the world melted away. This time there was no hesitation. No lingering doubts. He entered me with a force that made me gasp. The heat between us was almost unbearable, his body moving against mine in a rhythm that had me lost in a haze of pure pleasure. Every movement was calculated, every thrust intentional. He knew exactly what he was doing and I was powerless to stop it. There was no time for anything else but this undeniable need that coursed through my veins. I had been with David, of course. But this was different. This was an awakening, a realization that there was more to intimacy than I had ever known. And as he moved above me, I felt myself slipping deeper into a world I never wanted to leave. With each thrust I felt my body unravel. My mind went blank, lost in the sensation of him inside me. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer, and I was helpless to do anything but submit. And I did. I gave myself to him completely. When I came, it was nothing like anything I had ever felt before. It was an explosion of feeling, a rush of ecstasy that left me breathless and shaking beneath him. My body tightened around him, and I heard him groan in satisfaction as he followed me over the edge. We collapsed together, panting, bodies tangled. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, the warmth of his skin, the weight of him pressing into me. For a moment we lay there in silence, just feeling the aftermath of what we had shared. But as the haze of pleasure began to fade, I felt a pang of something else. Something darker. Guilt. The thought of David, of my husband, crept into my mind, but I pushed it away. I couldn't let it ruin this. Not now. Not after everything I had just experienced. I couldn't deny it. I was addicted to him. Days turned into weeks and the affair continued. I met him whenever I could, stealing moments of passion and excitement that I couldn't get from my marriage. But it wasn't just the physical aspect that kept drawing me to him. It was the connection, the way he made me feel seen, wanted, and alive. But as much as I tried to ignore it, the guilt was becoming harder to push aside. Every time I looked at David, I could see the distance between us. The love we once had was fading, and I was aware of it more than ever. It wasn't that I didn't love him, I still did, but it was different now. I wanted something more. Something he couldn't give me. The affair had become my escape, my secret world where I could be anyone, do anything without fear of judgment. But secrets have a way of catching up with you, and I was starting to realize that mine might not stay hidden forever. Are you ready for the next part? If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. This story is only going to get more intense. Stay tuned as I get closer to the tipping point, where everything begins to unravel. As I lay back on his couch, the cool leather against my bare skin, I couldn't help but notice how different this was from any experience I'd had with David. There was a level of urgency, of need, in his touch that had been missing for far too long in my life. And it wasn't just physical, it was deeper, more intense. His hands weren't just exploring my body, they were demanding, taking ownership of me in a way that made my heart race. I couldn't remember the last time I felt wanted like this. He kissed me again, harder this time, his lips rough and assertive. His breath was warm against my neck, and I could feel his body pressing against mine, almost possessive. There was no hesitating now. I wanted this, I needed this. Every inch of my body was screaming for it. "You're perfect," he murmured against my skin as his lips trailed down to my collarbone. "You've got no idea how much I've wanted this." His hands moved lower, tracing the curves of my body with a firm touch that sent waves of heat flooding through me. I moaned softly, unable to control the sensations pulsing through me. This wasn't just sex. It was an awakening, a rawness I hadn't realized I craved until this moment. His lips found mine again, and as our tongues met, I could feel the heat rising between us. I was lost in the sensation of him. His taste, the weight of his hands on me, the way his body seemed to demand more, always more. He knew exactly what he was doing. I was no longer in control. Before I knew it, I found myself lying beneath him, his body covering mine as he moved between my legs. There was no hesitation now, only the sweet, undeniable pull of passion. He didn't ask if I was ready, he didn't need to. I was already lost in the moment, already craving what he had to offer. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice rough and deep. I could feel his hardness against me, and I nodded, my fingers gripping his shoulders, my body responding to his touch. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips as I felt him enter me, slowly, deliberately. It was unlike anything I'd experienced. He was bigger, deeper, more intense. My whole body seemed to come alive with each movement, each thrust that sent shockwaves through my core. I gasped, my hands clutching at the back of his neck, pulling him closer as if I could melt into him. The pleasure was overwhelming, all-consuming. I could feel every inch of him, and it felt like I was being torn apart and put back together again in the most incredible way. I couldn't think about anything else but the sensations he was creating within me. He didn't hold back. He was relentless, pushing me to places I hadn't known existed. His body moved against mine with such intensity, such force, that I was afraid I might break under the weight of it all. But I didn't want to stop. Every inch of me was alive, every nerve on fire. His rhythm was steady and sure, pushing me closer and closer to the edge. I could feel my body tightening, the pressure building until I was on the verge of losing myself completely. And then it hit. The orgasm was like a wave crashing over me, sending me spiraling into a sea of pleasure that I had never known before. I cried out, my body shuddering beneath him as I clung to him for dear life. His name fell from my lips, but it wasn't a name I should have been calling. It was him. This stranger who had ignited something inside me that I didn't know I was capable of feeling. As I came down from the high, I could hear his breath heavy, his own release coming as he thrust deeper into me. The sound of our bodies moving together was all I could focus on now, the world around us fading away as we shared that moment of raw, unfiltered pleasure. When it was over, I lay there, gasping for air, my body still trembling. He stayed close, his hands gently tracing patterns on my skin, as though we had just shared something more than just sex. It felt intimate in a way I hadn't expected. He smiled at me, his dark eyes filled with something that looked like satisfaction, and maybe even possessiveness. "You're incredible," he said, his voice low and thick with desire. "You were worth every second." I couldn't speak for a moment, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The guilt was there, lingering in the back of my mind, but it was quickly overshadowed by the intensity of what we had just shared. I didn't know where this was going or what it meant, but in that moment I knew one thing for sure. I was addicted. Addicted to the power he had over me, to the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Reminder to like and share, subscribe to the channel. As I left his apartment that night, my body still humming with the pleasure he had given me, I felt a strange sense of detachment. The walk back to my car was almost surreal. The night air was cool against my skin, and I could still feel the warmth of his touch lingering on me. I hadn't been expecting to feel this way. Part of me had expected guilt to weigh me down, to crush me under the burden of what I'd just done. But it didn't. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of liberation. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the constraints of my marriage, free from the monotony of my life. And as I drove home that night, I knew I couldn't stop now. I had crossed a line and there was no going back. The desire was still there, pulsing under my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch enough. When I arrived home, David was already asleep, sprawled out on the bed, his snoring the only sound in the room. I could hear his steady breaths, but somehow I felt miles away from him. He was a stranger to me now, someone who had once held my heart but no longer had the ability to spark anything in me. I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him, my mind still reeling from the night. I was consumed by thoughts of him. The black man. The way he touched me. The way he made me feel. I should have felt guilty. I should have felt remorse. But I didn't. I felt alive. And I knew then that I couldn't let this be a one-time thing. If you've been enjoying the story so far, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next part of this tale. Things are about to get even more intense as the affair deepens and the consequences begin to unfold. Stay tuned. The months passed, and each time I saw him I felt more entranced, more consumed by the fire he sparked in me. He wasn't just good in bed, he understood me. I didn't need to say much for him to know exactly what I wanted, and he gave it to me in ways I'd never imagined. The sex was raw, the kind that made my body shiver with anticipation before he even touched me. And when we finally collided, when his hands claimed my skin, I felt it in my bones, every inch of him moving with such purpose. By now it wasn't just about satisfying a need. It was about craving him, about needing him like air. No longer was it just a stolen moment in time. It was an escape, a complete disconnect from the world I had to live in. But as much as I told myself it was just physical, deep down I knew it wasn't. That night I had told David I'd be late. He was working and I used that as my excuse. I'd arranged everything for the meeting with him earlier that day, my lover. The man who had broken through all the walls I'd put up. The man whose touch had set me on fire in ways I couldn't control. I drove to his apartment, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. My heart pounded with anticipation, but there was something else. Something darker that had been creeping up on me for days. The guilt. It was always there, a shadow lurking, reminding me of the man I was betraying at home. But as I knocked on his door, the guilt melted away. The moment he opened the door, that heat between us was undeniable. His eyes darkened, locking onto mine, and before I could even speak, he pulled me inside. He closed the door behind me with a soft click, and the space between us was gone in an instant. His lips found mine with an urgency I had never felt before, his hands roughly tugging at my clothes. This wasn't the slow, tender affection I had once shared with David. This was urgent, hungry. His hands on my back, pulling at the fabric of my dress as if time was running out. I wanted him just as badly. My breath hitched as he moved lower, kissing my neck, his hands cupping my breasts, squeezing them just enough to make me gasp. "I've missed you," he murmured against my skin. His voice was smooth, deep, sending waves of desire through me. My mind raced. Should I feel bad? Should I feel guilty? But I didn't. The only thing that mattered right then was him. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. He lifted me effortlessly, pressing my back against the wall as he kissed me harder, more urgently. I felt his body against mine, the heat radiating from him, and my heart pounded faster, my pulse in sync with his. He kissed me so deeply that I felt like I was drowning in him. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise. A wild, intoxicating promise. I was so lost in the moment that I didn't even notice him undressing me until I felt the cool air against my bare skin. I had no time to be self-conscious, no time to think about what this meant for my life. I had no choice but to give myself to him, to let him take what he wanted. He looked at me, his gaze dark with lust, before he kissed me again. He didn't waste time. There was no foreplay, no gentle teasing. He was already inside me before I could even think about it, pushing in hard, his body demanding mine. I gasped, the sensation of him so much more intense than anything I had ever experienced before. The way he moved, slow at first but then picking up a rhythm, a pace that sent shudders through my body. Every thrust was deep, purposeful, as if he were claiming me in the most primal way. It was unlike anything I'd ever had with David. It was raw. It was real. It was him. I wrapped my legs around his waist, pulling him closer, deeper. I wanted to feel all of him. His hands gripped my hips, moving me with him as he thrust harder, faster, the sound of our bodies colliding echoing in the small room. It felt reckless, dangerous, as if we were both on the edge, falling off together. And as he moved inside me, I felt it. Something I hadn't felt in years, something I had forgotten existed. The sense of losing control. I didn't have to be in charge, I didn't have to think about anything. I was his in that moment. And the pleasure was overwhelming. It wasn't just the physical connection, though that was enough to drive me wild. It was the emotional rush that came with it. The feeling of being desired in a way I had long forgotten. My body began to tighten, the buildup of sensation making my chest ache. I could feel the pressure building between us, and when it finally happened, when I came, it was like a floodgate opening. My body trembled, my nails digging into his back as I cried out. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't pretty. It was a release. He followed soon after, his body jerking against mine, his grip tightening on my hips as he filled me. I felt his warmth, felt the rush of him emptying himself inside me, and for a moment everything stopped. I was breathless, dazed, caught in the aftershocks of what we had just shared. He collapsed beside me, his chest heaving as he kissed me once more, gently this time, his fingers brushing through my hair. "God, you're incredible," he whispered, his voice soft now, filled with awe. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even think. My body felt spent, drained of all energy, yet somehow still craving more. And then reality hit me. I had just betrayed David. Again. The guilt crashed over me like a tidal wave, drowning out the bliss I had felt moments before. What was I doing? Why couldn't I stop? The questions swirled in my mind, but the answer remained the same. I didn't want to stop. Not now, not ever. Later, as I dressed and slipped out of his apartment, I could feel the weight of the decision I had made. I hadn't just stepped out on David. I had stepped out on my entire life. I was a stranger in my own body, living for the thrill of forbidden moments. When I returned home, it was quiet, too quiet. David was asleep in our bed, oblivious to the storm that had just unfolded. I slipped into bed beside him, my body still buzzing from what had just transpired. But as I lay there trying to quiet my thoughts, I realized something. I wasn't just living for the thrill anymore. I was living for him. I closed my eyes and the image of his face, his body, his hands filled my mind. The man who had set my soul on fire, who had made me feel things I had forgotten. How long could I keep this up? The house felt too quiet. I stepped inside, my movements slow, almost mechanical. David's things were scattered around. The familiar clutter of his work bag, his shoes in the hallway, the remnants of his dinner in the kitchen. Everything felt so normal, so painfully ordinary, and yet nothing about me felt normal anymore. I had just come from him, the man who had opened my eyes to a world of raw, unapologetic desire. He had become a drug, one I couldn't quit. His touch still burned on my skin, his scent lingered in my hair, and his voice echoed in my mind. But here I was, slipping back into the role of the dutiful wife, trying to convince myself that it would all be okay. David was still asleep when I entered the bedroom. He lay there, his back turned to me, unaware of what I had done, of what I had become. I crawled into bed beside him, trying to keep my breathing steady, as though nothing had happened, as though I hadn't just given myself to someone else. But I couldn't. I was lying to myself, and the guilt was suffocating. I could feel his warmth next to me, his steady breathing, and for a moment I wanted to reach out to hold him, to tell him the truth. But I knew better. The truth would destroy everything. I closed my eyes, pretending to sleep, but the truth was I couldn't stop thinking about him. About us. The man I had betrayed my husband for. The man whose body had taken me to places I didn't even know I needed to go. How could I go back to this life? How could I pretend it was all okay when every inch of me screamed that it wasn't? The next few days felt like I was living in a fog. I went through the motions, pretending everything was fine, but the weight of my secret was unbearable. Every time David touched me, kissed me, I felt like a fraud. I wanted to pull away to tell him the truth, but I couldn't. The consequences of that truth would destroy everything. And yet, the affair kept calling to me. Every message from him made my heart race. Every time he whispered my name in that deep, commanding voice, I felt myself drawn to him all over again. He wasn't just a lover. He had become my escape, my outlet, my release. How could I let that go? It was a Wednesday afternoon when I got the call. I had just finished a meeting with David, who was asking me to help with some work project I barely cared about. I was mentally exhausted and looking forward to an evening alone. Time to think, or at least pretend to think about something other than him. But then my phone buzzed. It was him. "I need to see you tonight. Please, just you and me. I can't keep waiting. I want you more than you know." My heart skipped a beat. The urgency in his words, the possessiveness in his tone. It was like a drug, and I was addicted. I texted back quickly. "I can't tonight. David is home. But I'll make time soon." But he didn't relent. Another message came in almost instantly. "I can't wait anymore. We need to talk. In person. Please." My fingers hovered over the keys. What was I supposed to do? Was I ready to risk it all? My marriage, my life, everything for this? For him? The phone buzzed again. "Don't make me beg. I need you." That was all it took. I was already texting back, making the plans. That evening when I showed up at his apartment, the air between us was thick with tension. He didn't say a word when he opened the door, just pulled me inside and kissed me hard. But this wasn't the frantic, wild passion we'd shared before. This was different. There was something deeper, something heavier in the way his hands traced my body, in the way he undressed me slowly as though savoring every moment. "Is this really what you want?" he asked, his voice low, the question laced with a mixture of lust and something darker. He wasn't just asking about the physical act. We both knew that. He was asking about my soul, my heart. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I just let my body speak for me. We didn't make love that night. We connected in a way that was beyond anything I had ever experienced. The boundaries between us disappeared. It wasn't just about sex anymore. It was about needing each other in ways we couldn't explain. We became one in every sense of the word. And yet, as the hours passed, something changed. The intensity of it all became too much. The reality of what I was doing hit me harder than it ever had before. I wasn't just betraying David anymore. I was betraying myself. As I lay there afterward, my body sore but satisfied, I felt a shift within me. The excitement I had felt before was gone. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel free. I felt trapped. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled me close, holding me as though he could protect me from the storm I was facing. But I knew that storm was already here. And it was only a matter of time before it would tear everything apart. The truth was inevitable. The lies, the secrecy, the guilt, none of it could last forever. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about who I had become. I wasn't the woman I used to be, the one who made promises and kept them. I was a woman divided, torn between the man I had vowed to spend my life with, and the one who had shown me what it meant to feel alive again. David would find out. I didn't know when, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the web of lies would unravel. And when it did, there would be no going back. The hardest part. I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the wreckage I had caused, to come to terms with the fact that my marriage, my life, was over. I closed my eyes, knowing that the path I had chosen would lead me to one of two things: destruction or a new beginning. But as I lay there, the sound of his breath steady beside me, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stop now. Not until everything had been torn apart. The days blurred together after that night. Each one felt like a slow-motion crash, where I could feel the impending disaster but couldn't bring myself to step away. I was trapped in this web of desire, guilt, and lies, and every time I thought about pulling out, about facing David with the truth, the more I wanted to sink deeper into the fantasy I had built with him. Him, my lover. The one who had taught me to feel again, to live again. The one whose touch could erase everything, make me forget the quiet desperation that had settled into my marriage over the years. When I was with him, I wasn't just a wife. I wasn't just a woman trapped in a routine. I was a living, breathing entity, a wild thing set free. But the cost was heavy, and every passing day I could feel the weight of it pressing on me. I went through the motions. David would go off to work and I'd stay behind making small talk, pretending everything was fine. But there were moments when I'd catch his gaze and I'd feel a flicker of something. A reminder of who I once was, of the promises I had made. And then I'd remember him. The man who had filled the void, who had ignited something inside of me that I never wanted to extinguish. It wasn't just about the sex anymore. No, that was only part of it. The affair had become an addiction, something I couldn't walk away from. The intensity, the chemistry, the way he knew exactly how to touch me, how to look at me. No one else had ever made me feel so alive. I was torn. Every night, I would lie next to David, pretending to be his wife, and every moment with him was an agonizing reminder that I was living a lie. But when I thought about the consequences of confessing, about the destruction it would bring to my marriage, to my entire life, I hesitated. I wasn't ready to face the fallout. But I couldn't keep running from it forever. It was a Friday evening when I finally saw the text that would change the course of everything. I was sitting in the living room, my eyes glazed over as I scrolled through my phone, trying to focus on anything other than the chaos inside me. David had gone to bed early that night, a habit he had developed over the past few months. We barely talked anymore. It was as though we were just two people existing in the same space, passing each other like ships in the night. Then my phone buzzed. "I need to see you." Now. It was him. The urgency in the message was unmistakable. Something was different. The intensity of his words made my heart race. I couldn't say no. Not to him. I quickly texted back, my fingers shaking. I'm coming. I knew it was a mistake. I knew this was the moment where everything could fall apart. But I couldn't stop myself. I was already in too deep. The truth would destroy everything. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I felt my heart beating against my ribcage, thundering in my ears. I had never said those words to him in all the years we'd been together. I had never needed to. But now I didn't know how else to start. He turned to face me, his face expressionless. The love he had once shown me was gone, replaced by something colder, something broken. He didn't say anything at first, but the silence between us was deafening. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Who is he? I didn't even need to ask who he was talking about. The question burned like a hot poker. His name is Jordan, I said, feeling the weight of the words as they left my mouth. Don't, David cut me off, holding up a hand. I don't want to hear it. His voice was steady, but I could see the anger in his eyes, the pain. It wasn't just disappointment. It was betrayal. It was the kind of betrayal I had inflicted on him without even realizing the extent of it. I trusted you, he said, the words heavy with hurt. I gave you everything, Rachel. Everything. And this is how you repay me. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell him how sorry I was, how I didn't know how it had gone this far. But the truth was I did know. And I couldn't fix it. I couldn't undo what I had done. I don't want to live a lie anymore, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. I don't know who I am anymore, David. I've lost myself. His face softened for a moment, but only for a moment. He shook his head as though trying to shake the pain away. I don't even know who you are anymore, he whispered. And that was it. The final nail in the coffin. It didn't take long for everything to fall apart after that night. David moved out 2 days later. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things. He just packed his bags, took a deep breath, and left. And just like that, the life we had built together was gone. The house felt empty without him. I stayed in the same place, the same bed, the same routines, but everything was wrong. Everything was a lie. I reached out to Jordan, but he was distant now too. He didn't want to be my escape anymore. I had been his addiction, but I wasn't enough. The spark between us had faded, and the affair that had consumed me now felt like a shadow of what it had been. He was gone, and so was the woman I used to be. I sat in the silence of the house, staring out the window, waiting for the storm to pass. But the truth was, the storm had passed. The destruction had already been done, and no amount of time would ever undo it. I don't know what comes next. Maybe I'll rebuild. Maybe I'll move on. Maybe I'll never find peace with what I've done. But I've learned one thing. When you chase desire, when you betray the people who love you, there are consequences. And no matter how much you try to justify your actions, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. I've lost everything, and I have nothing left but the echo of what could have been. But sometimes that's all you can hold on to, until you decide what comes next. Thank you for staying with me through this intense journey. If you're new here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep up with more stories. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. What would you do in my place? Would you choose the affair or your marriage? Let me know in the comments below.